advanced placement at that time. So that was really nice. So anyway, yeah, I want to tell you a little bit about the 60s. One of the main reasons I'm here is, besides being an English teacher, and of course, knowing a teacher here, is because I'm old. Because I'm 66, so I'm kind of a child of the Vietnam era, of the 60s. And I want to talk a little bit about that. I graduated from high school in '63 and went to McAllister. And of course, in the fall of that year, John F. Kennedy was killed. Right? And then Johnson took over. The war had started under, the Vietnamese War had started under Kennedy, but we just had, for the most part, advisors at that time. And over the next few years, up until 1969, the number of soldiers there went up to 550,000, which is about 6 times as many as we have in Afghanistan now. Resulted in 58,000 deaths. That is American deaths, not counting the hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. So it was an enormous event of the 60s, and there were other things going on at the same time. A lot of assassinations, in addition to John Kennedy. Robert Kennedy was killed in Los Angeles in June of 1968. Martin Luther King was killed 2 months before that, and Malcolm X was killed in '65. So it was really a pretty time of a lot of volatility. And it was kind of a good time, an interesting time to come of age. And one of the big questions, of course, was the war. What are you going to do about the war? Especially if you're a young man, which I was, and there's a draft going on. So the way the draft worked at that time, Stephanie kind of mentioned the kind of draft system of the Civil War and how it sort of evolved. At the time when I was vulnerable to it, you were a 1S if you were in high school, you were a 2S if you were in college. You could get other deferments if you were married, if you had children, and it kind of depended on just what time span you were in your situation. But I went to college, and partly, I guess, well, I would have gone to college anyway, but I went to college at this place in St. Paul, Minnesota, a pretty small school, 1,300 students at that time. Now it's about 2,000. Jennifer's youngest sister is at McAllister now. She's a senior there now. But Tim O'Brien was a year behind me in school. He's just 65 now. And we were both poli-sci majors. I started out in chemistry, and I kind of gravitated to poli-sci. We did have at least one class together. I remember constitutional law, having that. We were in the same dorm one year. And I remember seeing him and talking to him a little bit. But he's a pretty shy guy. Didn't know he was an English literature kind of a guy, really, when I knew him in college. But did get to talk to him a little bit later on. Well, I'll mention that now. Between my junior and senior year, I worked in Germany. It was arranged by the college. They emphasized that you should have international experience before you graduate. And the way I got mine was to work for the German Public Railroad in one summer for 2 months and then travel in Europe. And he did the same thing the next summer. So, during the course of his junior year, I talked to him a little bit about where to go and where not to go from my point of view. And then at the time I talked to him the most really though was his senior year. By then I was working for McCarthy. I'm gonna talk about that a while. Eugene McCarthy was a senator from Minnesota. He had been a senator with Hubert Humphrey for quite a while. And Hubert Humphrey at this point now, in 1966, 67, 68, was the vice president of the United States. And the president was Lyndon Johnson. He was the president during the big buildup in Vietnam. And there got to be increasing divisions in the country about, should we do this or not? The patriotic thing to do was to, support your troops and defeat those communists and save South Vietnam from the North. But if you look at it another way, we had agreed, the UN had agreed to a vote to possibly unify Vietnam, and we didn't allow that to go ahead, mainly because we were worried that Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam, would win. And we didn't want that. We wanted the present regime in South Vietnam, who was American educated in California, and who was Christian rather than Buddhist. We wanted them to maintain control of the country. So for a number of reasons, just sort of like Iraq and Afghanistan. Afghanistan's pretty clear cut, but Iraq is pretty complex too, and why we got involved there. For a number of complicated reasons, we got involved in the war in Vietnam. I was opposed to the war. I went through a period of, as Tim O'Brien did, and a lot of people did, we went through a transitional period. And so early on when I was in college, the first protesters were people I dismissed as being kooks, you know, and kind of like, what's wrong with them, kind of thing. And that was, I think, the general idea. But by a couple of years later, by the time I was a junior, I was with them. I was understanding. My understanding was that it was a foolish war that didn't have our interest at heart. That it was immoral and illegal and unjust, and the best thing to do would be to oppose it. And so I started protesting against it. And this guy McCarthy, the senator, was looking for somebody else to run against the president, also a Democrat, you know, his own party, to oppose the war, and looked to Robert Kennedy, who was at that time a senator from New York, to do it. And he didn't want to do it because opposing a sitting president during a time of war is something you don't just do that without really thinking about what you're up against. So anyway, eventually I graduated in '67, and I went to law school, and it seemed like the thing to do for a poli-sci major, and it seemed like, you know, it'd be okay, and it would keep my deferment. I didn't have any prospects of getting married to get a deferment that way. So I went to law school, but then I dropped out in January of that year and went to work for this McCarthy guy. So then I traveled around the country at primary elections. You know, the first, I wasn't involved. In New Hampshire was January, and I wasn't involved in that. But after that, I went to Wisconsin, Indiana, Nebraska, Oregon, California was June 1st, New York, and tried to get votes. You know, we campaigned to try to recruit people to go door to door, to make phone calls, to get voters out to vote for McCarthy. And things went pretty well. In the first primary in New Hampshire, McCarthy almost beat Johnson, even though Johnson was the president. Everybody knew him, and not many people in New Hampshire, relatively speaking, had heard of this guy from Minnesota who'd been running for president for a couple of months. Right? So it was amazing. He got 40-some% of the vote, and it seemed astonishing. And that encouraged Kennedy to jump in, which he did. But it took him a while to rev up and get the money and so on. But by the time that the Nebraska, the later primaries, when it got to March, let's say, then it was a three-way race between the sitting president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and McCarthy and Robert Kennedy. And the anti-war people were doing real well. And at the end of March, in a speech that wasn't about Vietnam, at the end of the speech, Johnson made this bombshell speech that I will not seek and will not accept the nomination of my party for re-election as president, as your president. So he was out of it. So then the vice president became the stand-in, essentially, represented the administration. So now Humphrey was running for president. He couldn't get on the early ballots fast enough because you have to get signatures and so on. But eventually, it would come down to Humphrey versus Kennedy versus McCarthy. The campaign went on. McCarthy won in Oregon. Kennedy won in California on June 5th, but that same night, he was assassinated. Right? His body went back from Los Angeles to New York that next day, June 6th, and I went on, of course, a different plane, but a lot of us went to New York too, and we started working for the New York primary, which was June 18th. And I told the other classes, it happens that night, because here we were, it was a funny situation to be in. We're opposed to Kennedy. I'd actually shaken his hand once in Indiana, Notre Dame in Indiana. In fact, the night before Martin Luther King, the day before Martin Luther King was killed in April. But anyway, we're running against this guy. We want to get votes and money, but he's anti-war, and we're anti-war. That's our main cause is the war. But the way we look at it, he should have, if he wanted to, he should have jumped in early. He should have had the courage to jump in earlier if he really wanted to do this. So, in fact, he even said to him when we were talking one time, there was a group. We also met briefly at a bar in Indianapolis one time, and Kennedy was saying he wished he had more people like the McCarthy people because we were working for little or no money. We eat subsistence, so they put us up. And he was having to pay college kids to come on weekends to work for him and so on. He said he admired the fact that they were more dedicated. But anyway, we had this situation with two anti-war candidates, and then the pro-war candidate and Humphrey really wasn't all that sold on the war, but he was the vice president. He couldn't undercut the president and the Pentagon and so on. Well, once Kennedy was killed, then of course it was between McCarthy was all the anti-war and Humphrey was all pretty much for the war. So it came down to the convention in Chicago, and that was a real volatile convention where Humphrey won. He ran against Richard Nixon in the fall. Nixon had what he called a secret plan to end the war. He was elected, very close election, and the war ended in '75. The last American combat troops left in '75. So there was a lot more time there, and as I say, there was 58,000 Americans were killed there. But Vietnam became, there are other issues. For '65, the big Civil Rights Act was signed in 1965. With, by the way, cooperation between Democrats and Republicans, something we don't see today at all. The deficit issue, the war issues, whatever it is, we see no cooperation. But there's the big division was between those favoring the war and those not favoring the war. But, for example, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which authorized the president to use force, was passed in the Senate by a vote of 98-2. So there was not the political differences going on in Washington that there are now, but the country was divided. And early on, as I said at college, who's the weirdo was the idea of 63, 64, but by 67, 68, most young people, I think, I haven't seen a survey or remember a survey, but most young people were really skeptical, and it kind of moved up, and by, it probably took 10 years after the war before a majority, but I'm sure if you surveyed people over 60 now, I'm pretty sure, 80% or something would say it was a big mistake to have been involved in Vietnam at all. But so anyway, this Vietnam thing was the big issue in the country during that time. And so I knew Tim a little bit from classes and so on. The only time I really talked to him, I talked to him an extended period a couple times. Once was just he was about to graduate in May, probably around the 10th or 12th or something of May in 1968. And he was feeling the draft breathing down his neck, which you read about on the Rainy River, right? And he wanted to know about McCarthy. And he had been doing some work for McCarthy. He had written some editorials for the school newspaper, and I think he'd done some bell ringing or something too. But he wanted to know what it was like compared to the Kennedy thing, what were the options and so on. He was just preoccupied, as a lot of people were, about the war and what to do once he lost his deferment. So we met at a restaurant near the campus there, and we talked quite a while about that. And he talked about possibly going to Canada. He wasn't sure what he'd do or not, but he was going to wrestle with this decision. Well, as you know, he did think about it. He went up to the border, he went up to the Rainy River and so on, but he didn't. And what's the reason he tells you in the story that he went to the war?
There's a difference between a storyline and a...
They did give him a lot of material, didn't they? Yeah.
He didn't want to lose his family in his community. He didn't want to lose his family in his community.
Yeah.
Oh, well, why he didn't go to... Oh, okay.
Why he went, why he did go. He kind of turns on his head. One of the traditional stories is you go because you're brave, to prove your bravery and so on. And he kind of turns on his head. He says he went because he was a coward, right? He went because he was embarrassed. He was afraid he'd lose the affection of his family or other people. He'd grown up, so it was the relatively easy way out to go along with the draft. And he did, and he started writing about it. Right? He wrote a book called "If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home." I mentioned in the first hour class that that's kind of a ditty that soldiers would sing or chant, really, to keep in step. If I die in a combat zone, box me up and ship me home. And it goes on, and I don't know the rest of it. I only know the title. But soldiers do that. You might get a kick out of this one. This is a World War II one that I used to do with my kids, Jennifer and so on when we were little. I used to go left. I left my wife and 49 kids in a starving condition without any gingerbread. Did I do right? Right to my country, but golly, I had a good job and I left. Right? So, but that was World War II. That wasn't. Pardon me for. I was stuck in a time warp. As Tim O'Brien was kind of stuck in a time warp in the Vietnam era. But anyway, that was his first book. He had written stuff for newspapers and magazines before that, but that was his first novel. And the next one I recall, one was in the nuclear age, this is the nuclear age. And he wrote one called Going After Cacciato, about a soldier in Vietnam, of course, by the name of Cacciato, who wants to escape the war and walks from Vietnam, in this fictional book, walks from Vietnam to Paris when the peace talks were going on. Then of course there's this book, you know, the things they carried. And even when eventually he starts to wean himself away from Vietnam, one of his books is called In the Lake of the Woods, which is mainly about a guy and his wife. The guy's running for Senate in Minnesota, but he's been a soldier in Vietnam. He is at My Lai, he was in a big massacre where American troops massacred, depending on who you believe, between 300 and 550 civilians, men, women, and children, which became a really big news story. Kind of like, if you remember the Abu Ghraib story from Iraq, kind of similar, you know, about torture and about, you know, questioning the motives of, the pure motives, let's say, of the Americans in those wars.
Do you guys all know about that? What he's referring to?
Abu Ghraib?
Yeah.
Abu Ghraib was a prison, well, it was Saddam had it as a prison, you know, in his era. But we took it over after the invasion, and so it became a prison for us. And you know, we were saying, the Bush administration, Rumsfeld was saying we don't torture and so on. Well, then somebody took a bunch of pictures of naked prisoners being humiliated with sexual things and with dogs and so on. And these are strict Muslims too, you know. And there were inquests and investigations, and people were jailed for it and so on. It was, you know, it didn't jive with the official story that was coming out. Well, My Lai was back in March of '68, where there was a photographer, well, he was associated with the Army, I think, too, but he also had a contract with Life magazine, and he published pictures of these bloodied villagers from this thing.
Isn't there that like super famous picture, and it's like this like a huge tower of fire, and there's a bunch of naked little kids running from it in Vietnam?
Oh, I know what you're thinking about. That's a different picture. I know what you're talking about. A naked girl with her arms up in the air.
Yeah, there's like 3 little kids, like probably the ages of 8, that are like naked and running by themselves, and there's a bunch of fire behind them, and it's supposed to be Vietnam, and they're like
a terrible look on her face.
Yeah, and they're like bloody and dirty.
That's a Vietnam. I remember that one. That's a Vietnam picture. But yeah. So anyway, photography, of course, brings it home. And another thing about Vietnam was that people were watching it on TV. You know, that day or the next day, as opposed to World War I, World War II. You'd read about it in the paper a day or a week later, or something like that. So there was an immediacy to Vietnam. That was the, you know, satellites. And satellites were now up in the air, and were now reflecting, bouncing off signals from around the world. And so you could see what was happening, and that probably, I'm pretty sure, helped to turn the stomach of the Americans against the war. That was going on at one time. The other time I met with Tim, it was just 4 years ago. There was a reunion back in McAllister, and we just spoke briefly about that time. We talked in the restaurant back in '68, and about his writing, and about his lecturing. He lectures at Texas, at the University of Texas, and about his attempt to, you know, get it out of the system, tell the story, and get it out of his system. But we just spoke briefly, but sort of related to the whole mystery and the frustration of reading O'Brien. And somebody in another class talked about the frustration that comes about when you're reading a story and did this really happen? I mean, that happens to you. It is real. Is this true? And he messes with us a lot, you know, on what really happened and what, you know, may have happened, or maybe some derivation or evolution of the truth. And related to that was, I had believed from reading his fiction that he had a daughter the age of Jen. Because one of the stories he writes called Going Back to Vietnam and taking his daughter with him. And so I thought, oh, you have a daughter the same age. That's kind of cool. But when I saw him there a few years ago, he was with his wife, who appeared to be about 30. No, he's 63 at that time. Or 61 or something. And they had 2 little boys. You know, one who was like 3 or 4, and the other was 6 or 7 or something. So as far as the way it looks to me, he's got 2 young boys. You know, and I don't think there is a daughter, but I don't know. If it's in real life, it's sort of like, you know, did this really happen, kind of. But I'm not a good friend by any means. You know, I'm just an acquaintance who taught English, and I did tell him that I use his stories, and he said, do I get the royalties? Yeah, you get the royalties. And I bought, in other words, did I just Xerox it and pass it out, or did I really buy the books? I bought the books. So. But he was joking. Well, then I said to him, our poli-sci professor we had together used to, he required us to read one of his books. But he would always say, he'd buy us a cup of coffee. I only get, whatever it was, 17 cents or something per book or something. So I said, you owe me some coffee or something. But, I didn't. So, let's see. What did I forget? I'm doing a whole different organizational, non-organizational structure this time.
No, that's great. Do you guys
I'm
have
just jabbering.
Well, do you guys have questions as he's speaking? You were gonna say something, Alex, or?
Oh, I was gonna say, I thought I remembered a part where he talks about his daughter being young and saying, can't you write about ponies?
Mm-hmm.
He says that in his book, and that put me under the impression too that he had a daughter.
Yeah, I had that. And in fact, his daughter asked him, "Did you ever kill anybody, Daddy?" Right? Is one of the. In fact, I think it's in 2 different stories. I think. Yeah, I thought so.
He doesn't have
Maybe
a daughter?
he's just,
He doesn't have one?
Well, I don't know for sure. I don't think so.
he's probably just using it as like a metaphor to like say that he's got this little voice in his head like telling him almost like he's like he's personifying like an emotion that he's having about the little voice in his head that's asking him and is innocent, maybe.
Yeah, he's certainly, he's, as I was sort of mentioning before, his own life in writing about Vietnam and bringing it up, it's sort of like the way he structures his stories, particularly the longer stories, how to tell a true war story, and the things they carried. He goes, within those stories, he's trying to get it right, He just sort of happens to mention, when he was killed, about Ted Lavender, right? The first time you hear about it, on the first page. Then the next page you hear a little bit more, then you hear a little more, then eventually you hear about the Zapwell zipping and stepping on the mine, and about, I don't know, I think it's early, one of the second or third time I think you hear about him being sucked up into the tree or something like
Isn't
that.
that a different
That's
But
guy?
you don't-
Kurt Lemon.
What?
It's Kurt Lemon.
Oh yeah, that was Kurt. I confused
Ted
those two
Lavender gets shot in the head or something.
Yeah, Ted got shot with Zapwell zipping. That's, but it's, right. But yeah, Kurt Lemon gets blown up into the.
You don't even hear about Kurt Lemon until he remembers kind of like that mission, and then he brings up like this one guy, and it's more not about Kurt Lemon dying. It's more about the relationship between Kurt and that other guy.
Correct.
That are like really good friends. Yeah, it's more about the relationship, I think.
Yeah, and writing to the sister and not writing back, and then they use the worst possible term for her. The way she's described it. So, it's a vagina term, but it's not. It's the worst possible, slang term for that. Because he's so angry about that, right? So, yeah, but anyway, he keeps trying to go back to these stories and try to get it, as he says, tease out the truth, but he's afraid it'll unravel as he teases out the truth.
You mentioned that you worked for McCarthy's administration, so he was anti-war?
Yeah. Well, now, you might be thinking of Joe McCarthy from, where you've heard.
Like McCarthyism?
McCarthyism is Joe McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin in the early 50s, who was a staunch anti-communist. He could identify 211 communists in the state. That's Joe, tail gunner Joe. He made up stories about being a war guy. He was in World War II, but he wasn't a tail gunner, but he claimed he was, so they called him tail gunner Joe. But yeah, he was embarrassed at the Army McCarthy hearings. But he was a senator from Wisconsin earlier. Eugene McCarthy was a senator from Minnesota from about 56 to 72 or something like that, later. A very different guy, really poetic, really academic, kind of weedy kind of a guy. But Joe McCarthy was kind of crude.
You were saying that the reason that you didn't get drafted was because you were in college? That was your job?
Yeah, and then I did get, I lost my deferments, when I was, after I quit law school to go to the McCarthy campaign, you don't get deferred for running against the war, So then I was subject to the draft, and I had to go through the physical 3 times, but I flunked it each time. I had bad knees, and I was classified 1Y, which is they won't take you unless there's a national emergency. But they would call again. And there was, maybe you've heard of the draft lottery. what they did was, they threw all the birth dates that are possible in a year.
Yeah, she was telling us.
Okay, and ping pong ball,
Yeah.
and my number was 271, so I was pretty low, you know, but I did get, you know, like, it's possible, but I was one lot. So I didn't have to.
How easy is it to do that? I feel like anybody would do that, just go to the physical and like.
Yeah, it's limp in there.
Yeah, just be like,
Yeah, that's a good point, you know, there's a lot of things unfair about it, you know, like, people who can afford to go to college, who can afford to get married, can afford to have kids, who are gonna get deferments. People who happen to run into a friendly doctor, you know, my knees are kinda bad, you know, but they referred me to an orthopedic guy. Well, it turned out this guy was a McCarthy delegate. You know, he was very much anti-war. And he just signed off for me, and they accepted that, you know,
wow.
for the first time. But what if he'd been, you know, very different, you know? So,
What happened the second time that you went in there for the physical?
I don't know which was first to say. The first time was in Minneapolis, the next time was in Fargo, the third time was in Los Angeles, because I was with the campaign out there, and I think I still had that letter or something.
Mhm.
I'm not sure how that worked, but I maintained the one. I think they still looked at everything, but maintained that.
Well,
But I did.
Well, what would happen if, like, you were drafted, like, okay, so once you go through the physical and they say, all right, yeah, you're gonna come, do you go straight from there, or, like, do you have
They give
time?
you so many days. They give you so many days to report to Section Fort Oregon or something.
What happens if you wouldn't go there? Would they search you, or, like,
Yeah.
yeah?
Yeah,
Like go to your house and.
I suppose.
But I think what one of the things that Stephanie was saying was that that didn't really ever happen because there would be too many people, right? Was there a lot of people who just didn't show
Well,
up?
some people went to Canada, and of course, people did try things. They took pills, or they you know, got really high, or they drank a lot of coffee, or something to affect their blood pressure, or something like that. Tried lots of things. Yeah.
What would you have done if you?
Well, yeah, I was gonna get to that. I wrote a letter. I wrote a letter to my draft board, and it was all handled through local draft boards. And my draft board was in Fergus Falls, Minnesota. And I wrote a letter to the clerk of that, Dana Zamani. I never forget the name of this draft board. My friends they were joining the National Guard, you know, and doing things like that, or getting married and having kids. So I didn't do that. So, and I thought about it a lot, of course, and I had concluded that I wasn't opposed to, let's say, World War II. You know, that there's such a thing as a justifiable war, and there also is such a thing as an obligation to your country and patriotism and national service is a good thing, but I believed it was immoral and foolish to go to war in Southeast Asia for a cause I didn't understand and didn't accept and didn't believe in. So I wrote this letter, and I said essentially that I was willing to serve my country, but I wasn't willing to put my life in jeopardy or the lives of others in jeopardy, so I would be willing to accept an assignment which would not place me in such a position. And then I took that letter to, first to a notary, well, I think, yeah, it was the lawyer's secretary, a notary republic, the secretary, who gave it to her employer, this lawyer, who kept it in a, well, he just kept it. You know, it was supposed to be submitted to them if I were drafted, and I never was, so I didn't have to, but I thought it'd be good to be prepared, you know, in advance, so that's what I did. But I didn't have to serve. I'm glad you guys are gonna, you know, be seeing people that have.
I was gonna ask, one of the things that we had talked about, cause it was mentioned in the book, was basically thoughts on what is fair as far as drafting and things of that nature. And we were talking about whether or not we believed it was fair to, that the law should be that the whole country and everyone votes for a war rather than having representatives. And I was curious what your opinion was on that, because all of us were like really back and forth on that, and we couldn't come up with a
First thing that occurs to me is that the people with the big bucks who buy all the, get the TV ads, and they have a big influence on people that maybe don't explore it all, I'd be skeptical of that. Because of the influence of big money in advertising. That's my first reaction.
We were talking about that as also the congressman too, that the congressmen may put themselves into a war because they're greedy and because they have big bucks, and that they might throw us into a war because it may benefit them personally. So then that was like another thing, but yeah, we were all agreeing that people aren't educated enough to decide whether or not we go to war.
Yeah, when we got to On the Rainy River, and he's talking about whether or not he's thinking about fleeing, and he says, if you're going to make me go, then you better go if you're voting for me to go, then you better go, or send somebody in your place. And that was one of the discussions we had from his comment in here.
This is really minor, but it occurs to me when you're talking about that. He has talked, I don't know if I read this or heard this or what, but he talked about the language. And the school's right, Todd. I always have to kind of prepare for saying, no, the F word's going to be in this story and so on. If someone here's really cannot stand to read that word, then I've got some other assignment for you. And I won't use it, but it's in the story and so on. But what Tim O'Brien says when people criticize him about that, you use this vulgar language. He says, well, if you send soldiers to war, they're going to talk that way. And so it's realism, of course. It's realism. Yeah.
One of the real parts of the story, actually. The language is one of the true parts of the story.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because you can trust that, can't you? Yeah, there's a lot not to trust.
It also confirms, he's talking about the story, and I almost feel like if it were all proper language and all that you would be like, okay, this is totally just a story. But the fact that he really puts the real language in there, you're sitting there thinking like, yeah, this is war talk, and it's more believable that way.
It's like what he said in the How to Tell a True War Story. A story might be completely crazy, but you have to have those little touches of normalness. In that case, it's the language that's the little touch of normalness that we can hold on to and wrap our heads around.
Yeah, after all, that's how we all link to the story. That's a fundamental way we link to the story, is the language. Yeah.
Did you guys have
Did you have a favorite of the stories you've read so far? Did you?
I thought the one that we just read. I don't know if we should talk about it. But that
We'll
one
talk about it. I haven't read it yet.
It was the.
Plug your ears.
What was the chapter called?
Sweetheart of the Song Trebong.
Yeah.
Because of the outlandish character?
Yeah.
It was because of the it was Rat Kiley telling a story. So it was like he keeps jumping back and forth from being at war and then back at home, and then he jumped from like that to like Rat Kiley's story, which is totally different, like medic in a different part of the war and all that stuff. I feel like it was really different from the previous chapters, and then like the story it wasn't like it seemed unreal, a lot of parts of that story. Near the end it started to get like really like unreal, but I still really like the meaning. I totally got it. It was like the greenies, the green berets, like they were just like, I feel like they were not real, but they were there for a reason, like in the story. They meant something. That was a really good one.
I think
They're kind of like the Navy SEALs that train out in Coronado.
They're all like secret agents.
Yeah.
That's what it reminds me.
I think it just showed like how you could like be there and be in the war and not know what's going on. Like the Green Berets were doing things that Rat Kiley didn't know about, and then like when the girlfriend disappears, like the boyfriend has no idea where she is or what she's doing, and she won't tell him. So I don't know.
Yeah, and it was like the way he like slowly. I read it all like really fast. The way he describes her in the beginning to the way he describes her at the end is just like the full on.
What an evolution!
Yeah, totally different. Like, and I didn't like honestly. The best part about the story is when I was first reading it, I did not see where it was going in any way. Like, I didn't see that coming. I thought it was going to be totally different. I thought, I don't know, something was going to happen with the girl, or she was going to be upset, or the other guys were going to get jealous. But the story kind of trailed off to something. There's a bigger meaning to it that you can't see until you read it.
Bigger meaning to
the whole chapter that you can't even like. Usually he foreshadows it. You know what I mean? You can kind of tell what the overall meaning of the chapter is going to be. Like when I read Friends and Enemies, I'm not gonna say I saw that coming, but I could like kind of predict that they were gonna like make up and like all that. But that one was totally unexpected.
I think that maybe his like whole idea was maybe talking about how much Vietnam can change you, because she starts out as like typical like American girl in like the 60s, and then she gets like involved in their culture and immersed in it, she becomes like a completely different person based off of that. I think maybe his point was to say like, when you come back from the war, you're not the same as you used to be, and like,
Yeah,
that
so
she understood that.
uses her as a symbol to show that how your innocent, you know, plain canvas can be transformed through war and that experience in that place.
I think that's what I really liked about it, how it just kind of, she started out so normal that it kind of relates you to it because you feel like you're normal, so you feel like if I would have been there, then this might have happened to me, you know, it can happen to anyone.
Relatable.
You can just completely transform.
I felt bad for her boyfriend.
Yeah, I felt bad, but it was like one of those things though, cause like he got the girl and he like was all proud about it, but he didn't think about it. Like, I don't know. I would have really thought about that. Or else anyone would have done it. Like bringing his girlfriend over there. Like he got to have like the joy of having a girlfriend. Like it wasn't even like he was gone. He had his girlfriend there. He had everything he needed. But then it can get really sour.
Do you think he intended her to stay that long?
No.
I want to read it so bad.
What happens when you
So-
fall back?
Eddie Diamond knew it too. I feel like he did.
What?
Remember what did he say? He said Eddie Diamond like in
Just
the
straight
middle
up
of the thing he's like, oh, it gets real. She'll know it. It definitely gets real. Like they were doubting it. They're like, oh, she's like so oblivious to all this stuff. And then I don't know. I remember one line he said. He was like very sure what happened. I'm pretty sure he saw it happen.
I haven't read the chapter yet, so I may just be completely off on a whim here, but is it really possible to do that? Can you go to war and like
I guess so. That's what he made it seem
let
like.
your basically let someone shadow you along? And
Well, the thing was is like
Could've just been another life.
he like Rat Kiley. The part of the story was to prove to like the other. I mean, one guy was like, you can't do that. You can't do that, and he was like trying to prove it to him. But basically, what had happened is that he just paid a whole bunch of money for her to fly to Bangkok and then like meet up with like army officials to get to where he was. He was in a spot that was they weren't like humping every day. They weren't like traveling every day. It was like one station, medic station. There was no commanding officers to say no.
It kept getting interrupted though. Oh wait, were you gonna say something? Oh. Was it you? I heard a voice. Go.
Or do you it's kind of like off track, but were you when you were younger? You were anti-war then?
Yeah, it became that way, yeah, once I understood it more. Yeah, or didn't I, once I didn't understand it more, I guess, or once I saw the flimsy foundation, almost the non-existent foundation.
how were your parents? Were your parents like that? You think?
No, they voted for they voted for Goldwater in '64. They were, staunch Republicans. And
I'm just curious.
I think for the war. I mean, I don't know if I asked them.
Did they approve? Were they supporting of your decision to go around and travel? Is like.
Well, no, they wanted me to stay in law school. So, but it was okay. I wasn't cut off.
So, would you ever consider yourself like an activist or anything like?
Well, I was at that time.
Yeah.
And I'm almost kind of ashamed that I haven't been very much since then. I worked on a congressional campaign in '72. I worked on a couple other kind of small things, but not much. I haven't done nothing really dedicated. Right now there's a recall of the Wisconsin governor going on, and I'll probably get involved in that, but not a whole lot.
But you were big on the elections and everything, right?
In
So in
68.
politics, you were
In
big.
'68, yeah, it was my whole life. Yeah.
Wow.
Sleeping in a cot next to the copy machines and stuff. Yeah.
That's crazy.
I don't think you talked too much about Chicago.
Yeah, I got beat up in Chicago. I didn't mention that at all here, but Chicago Convention. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, in '68, I was working for this anti-war guy, and Kennedy was killed. So then it came down to the convention, which was early August in Chicago, and the mayor was Richard J. Daley, who wanted to have order. And it was known there was going to be a lot of protesters, because there had been protests all over the country, especially in, like, say, Madison, Wisconsin. There have been enormous ones. And there was this party, the separate party known as the Yippie Party. Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were running this Youth International Party it stood for, and they were just kind of, I don't know, crazy. A lot of drugs involved and stuff, but anyway, they were opposed to the war too, and it was kind of the extension of the hippies, you know, the long hair and the hey man and that kind of stuff.
Just really
But
extreme.
they were going to be there protesting too. It kind of not all that different than I would, you know, the Occupy Wall Street thing. There's probably about a third. I don't know. I haven't.
90% hippies.
But probably a third of them are just kind of drop out.
They're just kind of
Well, I think
They're
I
just
know
there to
there's,
be there.
I know there's some really intense, really serious people
There's
who really
some really
study,
serious people.
who are very good spokesmen, and they're probably 50%. I don't know, but no doubt they're hangers on.
Yeah,
They
that's
always
right.
are, you know. So it'd be kind of like some of the hangers on to this would be part of this hippie group, and they did a lot of goofy stuff, like they let greased pigs go in the streets and stuff like that. They would teach these various techniques and
The hippie party.
the hippie party. But anyway, I went there and I was still working for McCarthy. And my job during the campaign, I had a lot of jobs, but it was mainly literature distribution, running off stuff and distributing it to the appropriate places. So I rented trucks. When we got to Chicago, I rented cars, and we were giving people rides, delegates to the convention, rides from their hotels to the amphitheater where the convention was. So, but I would stay in the parks where the yippies and where the protesters were staying mostly in the park. I had a hotel room, but I wasn't there all that much. And so I was part of when I could be part of the protest. And there was a lot of police out. Incidentally, another little aside, just a side note, ironic side note. One of my best friends the last several years was the sheriff where I lived in Wisconsin. He was a Chicago policeman in '68. And we were at some of the same places when one protester was pulled down from a statue of General Sherman in Grant Park and broke his leg. And I was there, and he was there. We didn't know that until years later. You know, we were talking, and I knew he was a Chicago cop. I said, "Where were you during the convention?" You know, eventually it turned out, you know, we were there. But anyway, I would go. I was part of the protest there in Chicago. And one time we were a lot of people got hurt on these. There was a study. There was an investigation called the Walker Report. They concluded it was a police riot. It was the police that rioted there. And one time I was walking down the street or sidewalk with some other people, and we were just talking, but we had long hair and we had McCarthy flowers on us and, you know, army jackets and looked weird. And so we were walking on the street and these cops, somebody yelled and the cops came after us and they jumped on this one girl in particular, girl that I liked of course, and grabbed her hair and was pulling her across the street. So I jumped in the back of this cop and I got a hold of his nightstick and I had it underneath his chin.
Yeah.
So then other people
I want to hear. That's what
other people grabbed me, and they pulled me across the street with one leg, and they used the nightstick on my privates as they're pulling me across the street. I ended up in this infirmary we called it was really the 14th floor of it was where we had a lot of the rooms in the hotel, but it was kind of converted into an infirmary, and some people were nurses and stuff, and they, you know, sort of took care of us. And so that happened there, and that was part of the
I would love
experience.
to see pictures.
But
I would love to see pictures of you back then. That would be
I was
so
just
fun.
thinking.
you know, there is a picture of me. I can't remember who found this out. I think it might have been my middle daughter. But there is a picture of me in one of those Vietnam War things. I don't have it, but there's a picture of me with long hair and an army coat and a couple of McCarthy. We had these flowers. They were daisies, you know. You know, the daisy with a
The
blue
hippie,
center that
the
said
hippie days.
"Clean for Jean" in it, and then there was the, you know, the white petals around it. Anyway, and we put them on cars and stuff. But anyway, there's a picture of me. Oh, and another thing. Ever seen? What do you have these things kind of? It's like Tim O'Brien. Or they come up later. Forrest Gump. Have you ever seen the movie Forrest Gump? There is a scene in there. Well, I saw it with my kids, and they, "Yeah, that's you!" And of course, it's not. It's a film. But there's a scene in there in front of a microbus, a VW microbus, with a guy like me, and it, "Hey man, we'll see you in San Francisco."
Oh my god, I know exactly what you're talking about.
And it
I know
looks
exactly
like
what you're talking about.
me then. And my kids just really freaked out. But yeah. I haven't seen that for a long time.
Now we need to watch it.
But there's a picture. It's got a white cover, and one of the history teachers had it, and they said, I think he told me first. Isn't this looks a lot like him? And I looked at that is me. You know, the shoes and everything.
Oh my god, that's funny.
But I'm like, it's like, you know, the camera's here, so you just, it's like a back profile kind of a picture.
I'm curious how exactly you got into the whole campaigning for McCarthy?
He
Like,
came to McAllister, and talked to us about when he was thinking about running. He was hoping somebody else would run. So, and they were teach-ins. They called them teach-ins, where people would come in and talk about the war. And sometimes they had pro guys, but people went to the anti-guys, and there were more of them. So I was, gravitating that way. And then I hated law school, really. And so I was running out of money, too. And then I decided, what I really did is I got a job selling seeds. By then it was the time when in the Midwest, you start seeing garden seeds show up in the grocery stores and stuff. So I got a job with a seed company in Indiana, first in Wisconsin and Indiana, because those were the primaries that were coming up. And when I read it, I used the van. I did fill the racks sometimes, but mostly I was hauling literature around. So that's how I got hired. And it wasn't really a paying job, but they'd give you some money here and there to keep you going. And eventually I left the van and called the seed company and said it's parked in a Kroger parking lot in Indianapolis, and I just joined the campaign. And then I was in the staff, and then I got a
So
little
they
more.
were recruiting people and basically.
What?
You were like recruited.
No, I volunteered, and I worked for free for a while, and then I proved some value and was on. They called.
So
I was
so
on
you
staff.
like met him and were.
What?
You were like met McCarthy and you were.
I only had a talk with him once, and that was in the Claypool Hotel in the hall of the Claypool Hotel in Indianapolis. And we talked about Dean Rusk, who was the Secretary of State, and how he hated this guy, about the Yellow Peril. McCarthy thought that one of the main reasons we were involved in Vietnam because of fear of the Yellow Peril, Asian influence. He talked about that. That's all I remember about it. I remember, the man, for me. I met some famous people. It's interesting to you guys probably. One of the more interesting, how much time do we have?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, one of the more interesting things was in the same hotel, Claypool Hotel, which was no longer a hotel. That's why it was cheap. It was an abandoned, almost like a burned out kind of building, downtown Indianapolis. So we had various rooms for phone banks and stuff. And we had all these rooms for money. We formed several groups. Vietnam veterans from McCarthy, mothers from McCarthy, students from anything you can think of, and trying to get money. You got to have money to run a campaign. Well, these mothers from McCarthy needed a refrigerator because they were bringing their babies in. They needed to get their formula in the refrigerator. I was the guy with the trucks at that time. So they said, hey, we need somebody to go to this place and get a refrigerator. Well, Dustin Hoffman was there. He was there to introduce Simon and Garfunkel for a fundraising concert that night, which I got to go to front row. But anyway, Hoffman was there. So I went down in this lobby, and I was looking for somebody to help. I wasn't going to move a refrigerator by myself, so can anybody help? And I wasn't getting. And finally, he said, "I'll go," and he did. So I went to Abbey Ritz with Dustin Hoffman in his truck, and we loaded this refrigerator and took it back.
Wow.
I also traveled around with Paul Newman. He was from McCarthy.
Oh my God.
Same thing. We put a speaker on the top of a truck, and he climbed up there in parking lots, like Kroger supermarkets and stuff. And he'd talk about why people should be for McCarthy. And I wrote an article about it, in fact, too, that was in a newspaper. But yeah, that was just after Cool Hand Luke. Ever seen that movie? Good movie. So yeah, I met some other people too, Jack Jones and Tony Randall and some other, but just briefly. They were at fundraisers, like they'd need somebody to pour wine in a fundraiser or beer or something, so I'd be there and they'd show up. There are a lot of celebrities.
How did you get interested in being like an English teacher after all of this?
You know what happened? After I got beat up in Chicago, I was still in Chicago, didn't have a job, campaign, that was over. I needed a job. There was a shortage of teachers. I heard about this place called Western Teachers Exchange. I don't know why it was called that, but I interviewed, and there was especially a shortage in Michigan. They said, how'd you like to teach English in Flint, Michigan? I said, I never had any college English classes, I was a poli-sci major. No, that's okay, we'll give you an emergency certification. And I taught there that year. I got fired at the end of the year because I was still politically active, but I really enjoyed it. At that time it was sophomores, but I really enjoyed it. But I made collages and slideshows, anti-war slideshows. It didn't go over well with the people in town. But I really liked it. So then I went to I wasn't certified to teach, which you have to be, really. So then I went to grad school and got my certification and started teaching.
So you liked it?
Yeah, I like the kids a lot. And I like English. And the main reason I like English is you can justify just about anything. Ideas and writing and so on. You don't have to stick to, formulas or something. So that's why.
Cool.
That's why I became an English teacher.
Any last questions for Mr. Peterson?
Crack.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I needed a dose. Yeah, my fall dose.
And as you,
Oh, yeah, I have a last question.
Yeah.
Do you still have the same views on like the BLM?
Little, what?
You still have the same views, like you
Oh yeah, it was really stupid. Yeah, really. What a waste. What a waste. 58,000 Americans and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians were killed. And we get angry with them because they haven't located all of our killed National people. How about all the people we killed over there? They look over to us and say, where are all our killed?
Yeah, they have a lot more.
Stephanie, do you want us to turn in our
yeah, turn in your points on the way out, and then which chapter are you reading through for tomorrow?